Okay, I think, ladies and gentlemen, I'll start this webinar. So I'm not sure if Daryl's going to come and interrupt us, but just to let you know, I'm not Daryl. I am James Ketchell. I'm Head of Communications at the Association for Consultancy and Engineering. And bear with me as I come in and try and save the day. He's obviously got some online issues, but hopefully we'll have Daryl later on. So welcome to this webinar in the Navigating COVID-19 series. So this focuses on the government's furlough scheme, which has recently been extended until October. And on Friday, there was some new guidance issued by the government, and we're delighted to welcome Michael Archer, who's a partner at ACE affiliate Beal & Co. And at the end of this session, there will be a Q&A session with Michael. So please do send your questions throughout the webinar. You don't have to wait for the Q&A session. You can send your questions by clicking the pane on the right and adding your questions. So repeat attendees or people who've been on this webinar before will know all about this, but it is good to remind everyone this is best experienced through headphones, which will help cut out background noise. If you turn off your microphone, you won't hear your breathing in the earphones. So to ask questions, as I said, go to the control panel, which is in the sidebar, and we'll try and answer as many as possible, but don't worry, if there are any outstanding questions, we will share after the session. Also, if you miss anything today, we will be uploading this to the website in the next few days. Maybe we'll cut out the bit at the start where it was lots of silence. So if you want to listen to us again, you can. So yeah, please don't worry. If you miss anything, we will add it to the website. We'll also share the slides from the session. So over to you now, Michael.
Right, James, thank you.
Apologies for the technical difficulties. But I'll let you get going, and hopefully Daryl will come back after your presentation. Thank you very much.
No problem. Thank you very much, James. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm very happy to be talking to you today about the furlough scheme, or as its longer title is known, the Coronavirus Job Retention Scheme. You probably have read and heard a lot about the scheme already, but now we're about to go into a new phase, so there are some new things to say about how it will operate. Although you will notice the title of this webinar is Expanding Furlough, which in some respects will be happening. In others, there will be a reduction in the scheme, particularly as regards the level of financial support. So if I could go to the first slide, which is a recap on the this scheme. So just to refresh our memories about the scheme for those who haven't looked at it for a bit, the job retention scheme had as its aim at the beginning of the lockdown, avoiding employers having to make huge numbers of their staff redundant. It introduced the concept of furlough to the general population, and it basically worked by the government providing a grant of up to £2,500 per month, or 80% of the gross monthly wages of eligible staff. Those staff were put on furlough by their employers. So where people were not able to work, the government would help fund an income for them. An important concept behind the furlough scheme has been that those employees on furlough are not permitted to carry out any work for their employer whatsoever while they're on furlough, if the employer is to be able to claim the financial support for those employees under the scheme. There's been a huge take-up on the government figures. By the 31st of May, over 1 million UK businesses have made claims under the scheme at a cost so far of £17.5 billion. 8.7 million employees have benefited, and in the construction sector, claims have totaled £1.8 billion, supporting 680,000 jobs and made by 154,000 construction employers. It's been a very generous scheme in a number of ways. but one in particular, and that is that businesses have not needed to prove that they are or will be in financial difficulty as a result of the pandemic. Indeed, that aspect will not change as we go forward. So where are we now in June 2020? The scheme has applied to benefit employees and employers from the 1st of March. It was originally set up for only 3 months, but was extended by a month to the end of June. And a few weeks ago, on the 12th of May, the Chancellor announced that it would be extended again to the end of October. And this looks like the last extension, barring specific measures in specific sectors which are particularly badly affected. However, in saying that the scheme will be extended to the end of October, this does not mean it will be extended on the same terms, despite the original announcement suggesting this. The key highlights, some of which I want to explore in more detail today on this webinar, are as follows. The scheme is in effect now closed to new entrants. So from the 10th of June, that is last Wednesday, no new employee can be claimed for. The reason why this is the case is that an employee in the scheme has to have a minimum of 3 weeks of furlough by the 30th of June. So if you're listening to this thinking that you should start to put your staff on furlough and claim under the scheme, it is, I'm afraid, already too late. And there's only one small exception to that, is that's where you have employees who are on or have been on statutory parental leave and have not been able to achieve their 3 weeks furlough before the 30th of June for that reason. The second highlight is that these new rules will come into effect from the 1st of July. And the next thing to say is that the scheme will permit more flexible working patterns. Up to now, there has been a very clear demarcation between working and furlough, where you're not permitted to work at all. There were no half measures, no flexibility, no part-time, no short hours working. But from the 1st of July, part-time working and shifts in any work pattern will be permitted. There was a minimum period of furlough, and that does apply in the period up to the end of June, the minimum period being 3 weeks. That has in some sectors allowed a roster of key workers to share roles with periods of working and then going off on furlough for 3 weeks. But that was a pretty inflexible roster system. So as to accommodate more flexible work patterns, the 3 week minimum period has now become 1 week minimum. And that will be from the 1st of July. Employers will, from the 1st of August, incur some payroll cost. Some employers, up to now, have been able to negotiate with their employees to push pay down to the levels covered by the scheme, and also have had their employers' national insurance contributions and pensions contributions covered by the scheme. That will no longer be possible from the 1st of August. Employers will be required to take an increasing financial cost month by month and as a condition of the scheme. I'll explain this in more detail in a moment. The government's contribution will also progressively taper off over the next 4 months, month by month, ending on the 31st of October. And where employers want their employees to go on a flexible furlough arrangement, this will require a new flexible furlough agreement, unless that has already been contemplated by the terms of an existing furlough agreement. And this agreement must be kept for 5 years. I'm now going to the next slide and going to talk about one of the key improvements of the scheme and where it can be said to have expanded before I then look at the financial costs to the employer, which will increase. So how will flexible furlough work? It is different in concept, so it brings with it some complexity. It is not black and white, furlough will work. It can be a combination of both. Part-time, short hours, all sorts of shift patterns, intermittent arrangements, up to full-time 100% furlough, as we've seen up to now. So how do you work out what the government will pay under the scheme after the 1st of July? The first thing to say is it will be like two schemes, the old scheme and the new scheme. The old scheme for furlough up to the 30th of June will be claimed for separately, separate to claims for furlough post the 1st of July. You will be required to conclude all your claims under the old scheme by the deadline of the 31st of July. It's worth noting that deadline. It's also worth getting claims in early July for the period up to the 30th of June and not leave it to the deadline, as we shall see. The new scheme for periods of working or furlough post the 1st of July require you to work out three things before you can make a claim. First is the length of the period or periods in that month for which a claim is made. The second is the calculation of wages for which you seek scheme support. And the third is what are the usual working hours of your employee compared to what have in fact been worked. And you are warned by the guidance officially not to make a claim for a month unless absolutely certain that you have this information, or else incorrect claims will risk being made. For employees who have been on full-time furlough, who had a fixed salary, and who will remain on full-time furlough, it will be much easier to give that information, of course. But for others who are not full-time on furlough, this will be administratively quite difficult for employers. Claims are made on a monthly, month-by-month basis because the claim amounts each month will be different. You'll make one claim for all your employees, whether they are 100% furloughed or flexibly furloughed, even if paid differently. Employers will be required to keep accurate records of wages and hours. So let's look again at those three elements and see whether getting that information together is going to be easy to work out. So firstly, the length of the period or periods in that month for which a claim is to be made, that should in most cases be straightforward. If I've got a work pattern that lasted the whole of July, I make a claim for the whole of July. If it's only some part-time working over a week and the rest of July was taken up by going back to work full-time, then the period claimed is a week. Then looking at the calculation of wages, here we know, because it has cropped up before with the calculation of pay covered by the scheme up to now, that there are rules on what is counted as normal wages and what is not. For employees on a fixed salary, it's relatively easy. You take the salary, applying as at the 28th of February before the scheme started. For those on variable pay, it's harder. What is included additionally to regular wages are non-discretionary payments, including overtime, even if it's variable overtime, and other customary payments. What you cannot include in wages are tips or discretionary commission or benefits in kind. It might be worth mentioning to some of the listeners today who are LLPs, that LLP members who are paid by a fixed salary and are paid through payroll will be included, but their pay must be fixed. It can't be linked to profits and therefore variable. and you'll know that there are salaried member taxation rules that apply, and if those dictate that somebody is employed, then they can access the scheme. So it's the third element that's going to cause most difficulty, and that is, how do you calculate usual hours? The calculation is to enable a proportionate calculation to be done, and that becomes much more complex. Usual hours means what the employee has been contracted to work. For example, 35 hours a week in a normal working week, and that is often found in a standard employment contract. But if hours are variable, so it's for example, a 0 hours contract, or it's a seasonal contract, you have to have a reference point. And here you can use the average number of hours worked in the last tax year, ending on the 5th of April 2020, or by taking the corresponding calendar period in the last tax year, which you would probably want to do if the work has been seasonal. You can include non-discretionary overtime hours. So the basic task here, where you have anything other than an employee on full-time furlough with a fixed salary, is to calculate your employee's wages for the usual hours not worked. Usual hours will usually be expressed as a daily average multiplied by the period of furlough. And it is that element that the grant relates to, payable as to 80% and subject to the monthly cap. So now I want to move on to the next slide, which looks at the one of the features of the changes, which is the contribution that employers will now be expected to make. It's one of the key changes to the scheme, and there'll be increasing levels of cost that will need to be borne by employers. It will not be possible for employers to avoid this cost if they also want to access the grants under the scheme. So for some employers, this will mean looking at the furlough scheme again, particularly where they had, as many employers have, persuaded their employees to accept just the 80% furlough money that the government was paying, and thus making the continued employment of those staff on furlough a relatively cost-free exercise. You will recall that the scheme up to now has even paid the employer's national insurance contributions and pension scheme contributions, but that is changing. And it's going to change from the 1st of August. So I just listed those months there, taking us to the end of the scheme in order just to highlight the fact that each month shows a change. So 1st of July is no change. Actually, the level of grant is the same. From the 1st of August, though, the national insurance contribution funding and the pension scheme contribution funding will not come via the scheme and must be paid by the employer. From the 1st of September, in addition, 10% of the wage costs of furloughed employees must be paid. And from the 1st of October, this goes up to 20% of the wage costs. And that must be paid. It's a condition of accessing the scheme. So looking at the next slide, I've now set on the next slide a table. And the purpose of this is to show you on a month-by-month basis not only the increasing contribution required from employers, but also how the government's grant contribution is tapering off too. So in September, you can see that the government's contribution is not 80% and up to £2,500 monthly cap, but will reduce to 70% and a cap of £2,187.50. And then in October, the final month of the scheme, it will reduce to 60% and a cap of £1,875. So with the compulsory employer contribution, you will see that the scheme is designed to ensure that employees can carry on receiving at least 80% of their wage up to the monthly cap. So moving on to the next slide, what are the implications of this? Well, I'm sure this will be a fertile area for your questions, because clearly one of the implications, as any employer looking at the scheme support tapering off in this way, is to make decisions for the longer term for their business in managing wage costs. For most businesses, they'll be thinking either have to get back to business as usual as quickly and as safely as they can now, or else they will be looking to address the need to manage those costs. Some businesses, of course, just won't be able to bring their staff back at all. Good communication with staff throughout this process is going to be really important. However, some employers will see this as an opportunity, no doubt, to renegotiate the whole of their staff wage and benefits packages. Indeed, it has been reported that some employers have been doing so already, and the tapering off of the scheme will be a further incentive for other employers, or imperative perhaps for other employers to do so. So other measures that employers may have to consider are making full-time contracts now part-time. I suspect we'll see more zero-hour contracts. But I would suggest there's little point doing that, moving from full-time to part-time contract on a permanent basis, until the furlough scheme has ended completely, as the grant now, as we've seen, will contribute to part-time salaries. And no doubt redundancies will have to be considered by some employers. In relation to this, while the furlough period continues, the contract of employment continues. So if you need to give notice to terminate contracts, make the decision while staff are on furlough and not leave it to the 31st of October when the scheme ends. Periods of notice can be served while the employees are on furlough. And I think that looking at the time, that brings me to the end of the allotted time. And I think I've said as much as I want to say about the scheme, and be very happy to now deal with any questions.
Thank you, Michael. Really interesting there. My apologies, my Wi-Fi blipped as we started, and I got back 2 or 3 minutes in, so I caught all of that. Thank you very much. Had a few questions in, and I think the first one I'll start with was picking up on what you've just finished on there, in terms of what does an employer have to do to either extend furlough into the new section or to end furlough? What are the rights of the employee in that respect, please?
Yes, so there's a whole question over whether you should end furlough, whether you should keep your options open. I think perhaps I can answer that one in that way. But clearly, for a lot of employees, they were under full-time contracts. Then they went on furlough, and now there's the system where they can come back part-time. And for many employers, that actually may be the only practical way of bringing their employees back. And so there is a further change to the furlough arrangements that were previously agreed with those employees, and therefore they need to agree to that further change. So in other words, that they will be content to come back on a part-time basis. Now, part-time, of course, covers a multitude of different work patterns, and I suspect that many employers will want to keep that as flexible as possible and seek that flexibility from their employee when agreeing the new terms of a flexible furlough extension. So I hope that answers it.
Yeah, is there guidance on how much notice you have to give employees with the change on the furlough, either bringing them back in or putting them onto part-time furlough?
No, there's not any guidance I've seen, not any official guidance or even unofficial guidance actually as to any notice period. And I suspect this is something that just has to be done before the actual date when you're going to be doing it. But of course, it's part of good employer-employee relations. You should do it in consultation with the staff so they understand what the changes are going to mean for them. And of course, they will have concerns about whether it's safe to come back to the workplace, what measures you're taking as employer to ensure their safety, all that sort of thing. And that should be all part of the same dialogue. And indeed, many of the part-time arrangements that are going to be put in place will be dependent on risk assessments having been done and for the staff to be managed in a way which ensures that not too many of them are in the workplace at any one time.
Yes, thank you. I think you're absolutely right to point out that it's linked into the return to safe office working, isn't it? And that's a whole different webinar, I think. But there's a holistic approach to be taken there to ease employees' fears, isn't there? We've got quite a complex question about how transferable the right to furlough is. If you're taking on a new employee who was previously furloughed by their previous employer, are they eligible for the second furlough scheme? Can that right to be furloughed a second time be transferred across, I guess is the question.
That's interesting. But so if that employee is a new employee to that employer because of a transfer under 2P, so the transfer of undertaking regulations, then I believe the position to be that those rights to furlough will continue with them, so the new employer has the right to continue the furlough. If they are a new employee who's just been taken on without there being a transfer business associated with it, and they weren't employed prior to the end of February, then no, I don't think they will be eligible.
Okay, thank you. We've got quite a few questions coming through, so apologies if we don't get round to everybody's, but we will try and answer those and ask Michael to answer those. And of course, this will be recorded and put on the ACE website so you can log into this later. What happens, and we just talked about safe working. What if an employee is very, very reluctant to end furlough under safety concerns?
Yes, there has been a debate about this, of course. Can an employee refuse to go back to work when the employer requires them to? Well, I suppose there's two aspects. There is that aspect, and the second aspect is can they be forced to agree an alternative furlough arrangement which requires part-time working if that's a new provision in their contract? So dealing with that second bit first, they can't actually be forced. There needs to be agreement about seeking somebody who is on a full-time contract coming back on a part-time basis. So they can refuse to do that, and there might be consequences for them, however, if they do. And where this is tackled by the official guidance is to say, well, normally in a situation where the employer is speaking, consulting with the employee, they can persuade them to come back, but it sort of fudges the answer. The question as to if there's concerns over safety, again, that's a matter of consultation with the employee, but if the employer has done that and the employee is not coming back, then you could get into a situation where it becomes a disciplinary matter, that the employee should be back at work, but they're not. Again, official guidance fudges that as an answer, because it's not a good position for either employee or employer to be in, because inevitably that you've got a dispute brewing. But ultimately, if the employer's done everything they can and thinks they can justify the safety measures they've put in place, and they've got a safe working environment, and the employee still refuses, then that's a disciplinary matter that might end in dismissal.
Thank you. Yeah, for our members, I guess it comes down to proving that they've taken reasonable actions to make it safe. Is that a good summary?
Well, it would, yeah. And that would be, and the employer, of course, would not like an employment tribunal to be looking in minute detail at whether they had or hadn't done their duty to create a safe working environment for the employee to come back to. So they should exercise some caution if challenging the employee on that.
Thank you. I've got another question in, and this one comes up a lot when we're talking to particularly our smaller member companies that have put people on furlough who are involved in projects where they are the focal point. And it's that question of what constitutes work. What can an employee not do and do whilst on furlough to qualify for this? And I guess how much will HMRC ever chase or look into these sort of things, in your opinion?
Right. So what is work and is not work? So first of all, if the employee is also a director, and I know this is not necessarily the question, but it's worth mentioning. If they're a director, they have statutory duties and can perform those statutory duties, but they just can't perform their executive duties under their employment contract. But if we're not looking at directors, we're looking at ordinary employees. What they can't do is provide a service or something of benefit to their employer. And there's scant guidance on this from the official guidance, and it's very difficult for anyone to advise any further than that, other than to say that this is an area where extreme caution will need to be exercised, because it is, if you like, a classic area where an employer can find that they were ineligible to make a grant claim. They would by then, of course, have made the grant claim, and therefore HMRC will come running after them. Now, how likely is that to happen? Well, it's been emphasized that there is an audit process that could well happen as a result of claims being made. My suspicion is, and this is no more than a suspicion, it is a personal view, is that actually there will be some auditing being done, because there needs to be, I think, some way in which money is recouped, and I think you need to exercise extreme caution on how you determine what is work and what is not, and not stray over the line.
Yeah, thank you. I think an example that was quoted to me was where somebody requires security clearance for an upcoming project, and the security detail, and I assume it was the police, got in touch with that person to ask them to complete more detail on their form. And the question came up, was that seen as work, or was that something that, because it was possibly transferable to another organisation working in the same domain, whether it be nuclear or whatever, would that constitute work or be of benefit to the company? And it's a fine line, isn't it?
It is a fine line. I certainly wouldn't want to be sat here saying yay or nay to that particular issue. I don't think there's an answer to it, and I'm sure, like a lot of other people, you listen to employers who are being interviewed about what they're doing with their staff while they're on furlough, and you think, goodness me, they should not be doing that. Coming into the shop and making sure that the stickers are in place for the 2-meter distance. Well, that actually is of benefit to the employer, and that ought not to be something that somebody who's on a full-time furlough arrangement actually does. It's one of the problems, I think, of the furlough being full-time, 100% in the way that I've described in this webinar.
Does that apply to training as well? Because we've had a lot of requests for what is acceptable levels of training, acceptable types of training, probably more accurate, whilst on furlough.
It doesn't. So training is outside that. So you are able to train. And I don't know what the acceptable levels or unacceptable levels are. Again, I've not seen any guidance about that, but certainly in the official guidance, it does refer to training being something that is, although that does benefit both employee and employer, it is something that can be done.
Yes, I mean we ourselves at ACE have had members of staff on furlough who have done Photoshop and Excel training from the internet, and I very much hope that's acceptable. But I think the question becomes more complex when we've got young engineers that are on graduate schemes or apprenticeship schemes that normally would do their learning at the workplace in the office with senior members of staff supervising. And the question was asked, could they, when the offices reopen, could they go back in just to do that sort of training, because it's very, very project-based?
Well, apprentices are different, and there's a distinction made with apprentices. Their training is not outside the furlough scheme, so they're effectively, that's treated like work. But other training, training that's informal in the office as opposed to going on a training course, I don't know the answer to that, actually. I think it may be, my instinct is to say it's straying into the wrong area. If it's going on a third-party course or away from the office or workplace, then I think it's easier to say that's really for the employee's own benefit.
Yeah. Thank you, Michael. I'll rip through a couple of quick questions now to get through some. Good question here. It's called a grant. Does that mean that there is a possibility of having to repay it in the future?
Okay. No suggestion at all has been made in any announcement or any of the guidance that it would be repayable. I have, however, a personal view that the government may well seek to look at who are the beneficiaries of the grants and adapt some future tax rule or something like that to try and claw back some of the money, but it's only a sort of a personal view, but no suggestion officially that this is repayable.
Okay, thank you. And could you confirm the cut-off date for qualification? So my understanding is that people had to finish their 3 weeks of furlough by the end of June. Is that correct?
That is right. Yes. Yeah. So there is a minimum period of furlough 3 weeks that has to be achieved by the end of June, with that one exception of anyone who's on statutory parental leave, which has prevented them from completing that 3 weeks.
Thank you. And does it make any difference if a company's payroll cut-off date is not the end of the month? So if the date of either payment or the payroll cutoff to try and get an accurate response is not the end of the month?
It doesn't. It doesn't make any difference, I think. I mean, we're talking about now as opposed to the payroll date at the beginning of the furlough scheme.
Yeah, I assume it wouldn't change. So I think if people have got a payroll cut-off date that isn't the end of the month, that's obviously going to make their calculations quite complex, isn't it?
It is, yeah. And they might have to use a totally separate calculation for their claim under the scheme as they do for payment under the payroll. I think the whole thing is going to be extremely complicated for those who have different work patterns and shift patterns for employees. So the claim is made per employee. So each one could have their own pattern, an own number of hours, and compared to their own number of normal hours. All that has to be done each month. Yes, you're right, at the end of the month, and I think it would be quite burdensome.
So seek advice, I think, is probably
the seek advice about it. If it's complicated, then you most certainly need some help. And there are some examples set out in the official guidance actually that cover a multitude of different arrangements. So the first go to those because they might help point in the right direction for the calculation.
Thank you. One more question. Are there any members of staff that can't be furloughed, and has that changed for the new scheme?
Well, those members of staff who have been furloughed are the ones who can go into the new scheme. It's not a scheme from the point of view of new eligibility and new people that can join in it, because one of the criteria is you've got to have had your claim made and be eligible for furlough under the old scheme before you are able to claim from the 1st of July.
So there's no change in that respect.
There's no change. Yeah.
That's great. Thank you. I think we've just about covered all of the questions there, Michael. So I'd like to thank you very much for that, and I think we're getting close to our time. Many thanks for listening, everybody. I hope you found that interesting. It's a complex subject, and I'm sure Michael and Beal & Co would welcome any approaches. If anybody needs any further help, please keep an eye out on our websites for upcoming webinars. As I said before, we've recorded this webinar and we'll send a link later out today for everybody from Chetna, so that you can refer back and listen again if there's any areas that you need a bit more detail on. And on our website, we've also got a latest blog by Wendy Lizapican, who's ACE's Director of Compliance, and she's done an overview on the major changes to the scheme, and we've updated our employment scheme guidance to reflect all those changes we talked about today, so hopefully that will help you. Lastly, you can find more information on all of our updated guidance on ACE's dedicated COVID-19 hub, and we've got the webinars from ACE in the previous series that are all on the website on all of these subjects that have been pertinent, and Infrastructure Intelligence is doing its COVID-19 webinar this week on changing business models. They're happening every Friday. This one's about changing business models, looking to the future. So all that leaves for me to do is say thank you very much, Michael, for your talk today. It's been really useful, and I hope everybody's found that interesting. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Goodbye, everybody.